Hello and welcome to Securing Justice, a housing insecurity podcast series brought to you by the California Center for Ethics and Policy in the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences at Cal Poly Pomona. This project was made possible with support from California Humanities, a nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can learn more about Cal Humanities at calhum.org. My name is Alex Madva, and as director for the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, and on behalf of the CCEP faculty fellows who are co-organizing Securing Justice, that is Brady Collins, Corey Aragon, and Michael Wu, we are pleased to bring you a panel discussion about the eviction crisis on the horizon, rent relief and pandemic recovery in California. But first, I'd like to encourage you to visit our website, and I am dropping that in the chat right now. And you can do that to sign up for our mailing list and stay up to date about all future events. We've been pleased to offer a full lineup of events this spring, and we have 2 more coming. So please mark these dates down in your calendar, and we will follow up with more details as soon as we have them. Both of these events will deal with redlining, racial segregation, and wealth accumulation. So on Friday, April 23rd at 1 p.m., we'll have a panel discussion about redlining, segregation, and wealth accumulation. Then on Friday, May 7th at 1 p.m., CPP professor Anthony Orlando and his colleagues, Brian Ahn and Seva Rodnyansky, will be presenting The Physical Legacy of Racism, How Redlining Cemented the Modern Built Environment. And I'm dropping the link for that in the chat right now. This is a link to the preprint of their paper. So all of these events will be open to the public, and we encourage you to share the invitations widely. Again, today's panel will discuss the eviction crisis on the horizon, rent relief, and pandemic recovery in California. Nearly half of Californians are renters, and many were already facing housing insecurity prior to the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic-related shutdown has therefore put many rent-burdened residents out of work for months. With little to no income, they have been struggling to feed their families and pay the bills. While the governor has passed legislation to prevent widespread evictions, at some point the bill for unpaid rent will be due, meaning California runs the risk of an unprecedented eviction crisis in a state already struggling with affordable housing and homelessness crises. How are tenants faring during this crisis? What regulatory power does the government have to protect them during such an emergency? In a state as large as California, what role do cities and counties have to respond to local needs? In a discussion of the messy politics of pandemic recovery, this panel will explore these questions and what this all means for tenants in California. We have 3 esteemed panelists today. First, Faiza Malik is a senior staff attorney with the Community Development Project at Public Counsel, where she provides policy, advocacy, and litigation support to community groups and grassroots coalitions to advance housing justice and inclusive and equitable development. Before coming to Public Counsel, Faiza was senior legislative counsel at the New York City Council, where she drafted and advised on housing and transportation policy. Pamela Augustin is the coalition manager for East Side Leads, a coalition of tenants and community-based organizations in the East Side of Los Angeles that organizes and advocates for accountable development without displacement. She was born and raised at the border between Mexico and the USA in Mexicali, Baja California, and is a proud alumna of UC Riverside. Gary L. Blasi is professor of law emeritus at UCLA, who has both conducted research and been involved in advocacy aimed at ending homelessness for more than 35 years. A former president of the National Coalition for the Homeless, he also maintains an active pro bono legal practice on behalf of unhoused people and has twice been named a California Lawyer of the Year since he took emeritus status. Today's moderator will be CPP Professor of Political Science and Faculty Fellow for CCEP, Brady Collins. He has spent several years as a policy advocate in the housing and labor movement in Los Angeles, though he has also conducted research in Barcelona, Tokyo, and Shanghai. His areas of expertise are in community and economic development, urban politics, housing policy, and ethnic enclaves. On that note, I will hand the virtual mic over to Dr. Collins.
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Thanks for the introduction. I'm also really happy to have our 3 panelists with us. Thank you so much for being here. So to kick things off and sort of set the table a little bit, I wanted to first talk to you, Pamela, about what's going on in East LA, where East Side Leads works, And before we talk about the economic shutdown, I was wondering if you could just briefly tell us a little bit about what East Side Leads does and the communities that East Side Leads works with.
Of course. Thank you, Brady, and thank you, Alex, and to everyone watching today. Eastside Leads, Leadership for Equitable and Accountable Development Strategies, is a coalition that brought, like Alex mentioned, brings together not just tenants, but also community-based organizations, primarily from Boyle Heights. And in 2017, we came together because all of the organizations that had historically been working for over 10 years, fighting, organizing, drafting amazing policy that centered the needs of community residents, realized after 10 years, right, that gentrification, that market pressures were still displacing community in Boyle Heights. At the time, back in 2017, before the pandemic, of course, we learned that LA County had a vision that was already almost 20 years in the making of creating the Silicon Valley in East Los Angeles. Specifically, they wanted to target, the county had a very clear plan on doing innovation and focusing on the bioscience industry. So that was a major concern for the organizations that today continue to lead Eastside Leads, and to the resident leaders, majority who are tenant, by the way. So we came together and we, met with community residents. We spent the first year of our coalition really bringing it down to the basic question: what does your community look like without displacement? And what we learned is 14 different ways that community wanted development, investment, policies to impact them. One of those very clear directives that our coalition got from engaging with residents, youth, and parents alike was we needed to strengthen tenant protections. We needed to expand rent control laws. We needed to look beyond just preserving and building affordable housing and think about different ways of housing people, keeping people home, keeping people in their communities. So that's what has, today, for almost 4 years later, led to our belief as a coalition that we can really only make change by coalescing with other communities. In our past 4 years, Brady and team, we've learned that working in coalition, going beyond just the household, going beyond the organization is needed. But like I mentioned, tenant protections became a key component of our work. And that work continues today by strengthening tenant protections during COVID-19, by demanding stronger accountability to the needs of residents during COVID-19, and laying the groundwork, working alongside coalition so that when we do recover, we don't just recover back to what was, before the pandemic, but to a stronger, more equitable, to a future where no one is displaced.
Thank you. So bringing us back a little bit to March 2020, the pandemic hits California. Shortly thereafter, the governor announces, a massive economic shutdown. What did y'all at Eastside Leads hear from tenants on the ground? What were the reactions that people had? What was it like to be a tenant in Boyle Heights and suddenly learn where you worked may be shut down and you can't earn an income, you can't leave your apartment?
Yeah, that's a very important question. So that was March 2020, right? 1 year ago. I think before I answer that question though, Brady, I want to take it to 2019 to once again rent control, rent stabilization for LA County. At the time in 2019, we partnered with UCLA and Public Counsel to look at what was happening in the county, not just in unincorporated East LA, but countywide. And what we learned is that over 50% of residents, tenants in each supervisorial district were severely rent burdened. And severely rent burdened, for folks that may not know, is when you pay more than 50% of your income in rent. 30% is the ideal, right? And what that report also showed us is that 22% of households that were headed by women were even more likely to be severely rent burdened. So back in March 2020, now the pandemic, that demographic, that fact that we learned in 2019, that was reinforced, right, that we heard anecdotally on the ground, but reinforced by priced out, pushed out, locked out, the report that we published in 2019, what we see is it's the same communities that are, facing disproportionately the hardest impact because of the pandemic. They lost their jobs. They are the essential workers. They are the street vendors. They are the ones that our economy, that our system left behind before the pandemic. And all of a sudden, they had to make ends meet. And that was the concern that we heard in March. I'm a street vendor, Pamela, ELAC, Public Council, and all the coalition partners of our coalition. I cannot go vend. How am I going to make a living? Or I am, I can't work. My work shut down. I'm undocumented. How am I going to make a living? So their incomes were impacted by the closures. At the time, their biggest worry was, how are we generally going to make an income, not just to pay rent, but to pay for food? To now all of a sudden, they had to care for their families at home. What we also saw from our youth organizing partner organizations, Inner City Struggle and Legacy LA, is that high school students all of a sudden became not just, like the childcare provider to their younger siblings, but also at times the person that had to go out, find work. So really in March, April, and May, we were learning so much, but we were definitely responding to the fact that everyone's world was in turmoil. And it continues to be. We haven't really had, I would say, the strongest protection against families putting their lives at risk, going out and trying to make a living, because we don't have, right, a moratorium on all evictions, because we don't have really a strong public effort to keep families housed. Once again, evictions still continue during the pandemic. I'll pause there.
Yeah, no, thank you. And that's a great segue to talking about, can tenants be evicted? What laws have been passed? So I want to bring it to FISA and ask that question. What was the response to these conditions? Again, thinking back to March, April, May initially, what was the response to these conditions? What laws were passed to protect tenants, and have they been effective?
Sure. So yes, thank you for having me, and it's good to be on this panel with Gary and Blake, and Pam and you. So the answer to that question is yes and no. So currently there's a patchwork of eviction protection laws at the state, local, and federal level. And it's important for tenants to understand, like Pam said, that there is no moratorium on evictions right now. There are prohibitions on certain types of evictions, such as non-payment or no-fault evictions, but landlords can still file evictions. The most effective protection was the state judicial council rule that was in place from April 2020 to August 2020, which was an actual moratorium on the filing of all evictions. But then after the judicial council rule expired, the state passed AB 3088, which broadly speaking removed unpaid rent as the basis for eviction, so long as tenants paid 25% of the rent and provided required notices to their landlord. And then AB 3088 was recently extended by SB 91 until June 30th, 2021. And the law is complicated. There are a lot of parts to it, so we recommend speaking to an advocate or a lawyer. And you can read more about the state's law at housingiskey.com. And then locally, when the pandemic started, the city and county adopted their own eviction protections in March. And then the local protections cover more than the state law. So for example, a landlord cannot evict tenants for a no-fault reason, such as an owner move-in or an Ellis. Act eviction, and they give tenants 12 months to repay their rent debt. They also prohibit late fees and rent increases on rent controlled units. So again, it's important that LA County did adopt that rent stabilization law, because that allowed for the county to prevent rent increases. And then both the county and city's protections are still in effect currently with the state law. There are slight differences between them. So I encourage folks to go to the city and county websites to get more information. So for the city, that would be HCIDLA. And then for the county, it's a DCBA. And so when landlords comply, I think, and then again, at the federal level, there is a moratorium from the CDC that came out in the fall, and it's being challenged in the courts. And so it has been kind of extended on a temporary basis. It provides sort of some gap protection in California for certain types of evictions. It's currently expiring March 31st. And we're waiting to hear from the Biden administration if they're going to extend it again. So some uncertainty there. But I think luckily in California, we have state and local protections in place, whereas in other parts of the country, they're really relying on the CDC protections. So when it comes to the protections and how effective they've been, I think when landlords comply, the laws have been effective at keeping the eviction tsunami that we were talking about and expecting at bay. But since we don't have a total moratorium, there still are evictions happening. Many landlords are filing evictions under other bases that are not protected by the laws. And again, there are tenants that don't have lawyers. And so lack of access to counsel is really, there's a lot of confusion in the patchwork about rights that tenants have. And so more commonly, what we're seeing is just tenants slipping through the cracks. We're seeing landlords turning to extra legal measures to replace tenants. So illegal lockouts, extreme harassment of tenants to get them to leave. And I think, so in sum, the eviction protections that we do have been crucial at keeping tenants housed, but we don't have a total moratorium. We need to protect tenants. There's a patchwork of laws and rules for tenants to know. So it's important for tenants to have access to advocates and organizers and lawyers. There's a program called Stay Housed LA, which connects tenants to lawyers, which has been great, but it needs to be expanded. We need to guarantee right to counsel for every tenant, because when the protections do lift, we're going to see we are going to see a massive wave of evictions, I think. We don't have the cancellation of rent. So the rent, we have rent relief, which I'm happy to talk about a little later, but there are going to be people falling through the cracks. And so we do now need to think about what protections we need to put in place for when the eviction protections expire. And then the last thing I'll note is that we also, to combat harassment, I think it's apparent we need strong anti-tenant harassment policies that can be enforced.
Thank you. Yeah, so there's a lot in there, and I hope we can dive into some of the specifics there. But what I'm hearing is, if you've got a kind landlord and you've got access to legal counsel, chances are you were able to stay housed and be protected, felt protected during this. That's not the case for everyone, of course, and that's I think what we want to talk more about, and then also just a really complicated framework that includes the federal government's response, the state government's response, the local government's response. And so I hope we can dive into that a little bit more, but I wanted to bring Gary into the conversation now as well. And Gary, I know you've done a lot of research on the housing crisis, on homelessness prior to the pandemic hitting. And so I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about the sort of underlying social and economic inequities in Los Angeles and how the pandemic has interacted with what was already the conditions on the ground, and what that has meant during the pandemic for tenants and for the unhoused. Nope, you're muted.
First rule of Zoom is be able to make yourself heard. Basically, COVID and the economic collapse just intensified dramatically everything that was going on before. It didn't create any new problems, it just amplified them. And where there were inequalities, it made those inequalities even more stark and more severe. Like everyone else, when COVID happened, it was unexpected. But having been an eviction defense lawyer for many years and having worked with low-income tenants, it was obvious that with so many people unemployed, there was going to be potentially a huge wave of evictions. And so I work with folks at UCLA to try to estimate what the scope of that problem would be. And based on early unemployment figures, we estimated back in May that there were about 365,000 households in LA County that were at a very high risk of eviction if evictions were allowed to proceed and if the government didn't do something to stop them. So there was this kind of looming catastrophe. Some people called it a tsunami. I don't know what you could call it, but it would have been the biggest mass displacement of people in American history, frankly. And in LA County, had some steps not been taken, and FISA's gone over many of those steps. Unfortunately, and we'll come back to this, I think, it's not exactly clear what's happened beyond sort of kicking the can down the road, which is what happened during the entire period of the pandemic up until the last few months, which was that the Judicial Council, as FISA pointed out, stopped evictions, all evictions, by prohibiting any court in California from issuing a summons in a case. So you couldn't actually begin an eviction case in California until that was lifted. And then there were these other moratoria and so on that were sort of backups, but they all had major loopholes. They required different kinds of notices. They required tenants to understand how to use them, but mainly they didn't stop evictions. They didn't prevent a landlord from filing an eviction as the court had done. So it's important to back up to see where we started before the pandemic, though. And one number that's always sort of framed how I think about this is that Economic Roundtable, a nonprofit that I work with, did an extensive study a couple of years before the pandemic and found that in LA County, there were 600,000 people living in households that paid 90% of their income on rent. So I don't know whatever is beyond extremely rent burdened. There are a lot of people in that category as well. And all of those people are right on the precipice of becoming homeless. And in fact, every month, even before the pandemic, more than 10,000 people in LA County fell into homelessness, at least for some period of time. Most of them would get back into the housing market, but they sort of circulated between homelessness, sleeping in cars, sleeping on couches, getting back into housing, and so on. And that was a sort of invisible part of what is the most visible part of housing inequality and the housing problem, which is homelessness. But people have tended, I think, to sort of to separate those two issues, but they're really the same issues. They're both principally the product of a lot of extreme poverty in a circumstance, in a society where housing is a commodity, meaning that you can have exactly as much housing as you can afford and no more. And if you can't afford any housing, you don't have any housing, with small exceptions. I mean, we have a very tiny amount of assistance available to people outside the private market in terms of Section 8 and that sort of thing. So that's where we started. And as we entered the pandemic, Los Angeles already had this very visible homeless problem, as indicated in the encampments that troubled neighbors and so on. But mostly they troubled the people who had to live in those encampments because that was the best choice that they had. And before the pandemic, more than half of all the unsheltered people in America, homeless people lacking shelter of any kind, more than half of them lived in California. And about a quarter of them, a little more than that, lived in Los Angeles County. So 1 in 4 unhoused, unsheltered homeless people lived here in California, out of the 330 million people in the country. The disparities between rich and poor were aggravated tremendously by systemic, institutionalized, longstanding racism that has expressed itself in many different ways. For quite some time now, it's been the case that in Los Angeles County, if you are Black, your odds of being homeless compared to a white person are approximately 10 times as high. So it's one of the most dramatic disparities you can see in any kind of social data. The probability that you are homeless is so dramatically different. It's partly because of differences in income, partly in other things. But we have tended to talk about homelessness as and the housing crisis as a question of affordable housing. But when people hear that phrase, they tend to hear just the housing part of it. The affordable part of it is the part that has to do with income. And the number of people who have incomes below a level that would essentially mean that they could never contribute to any significant part of their housing costs is in Los Angeles County a very large number. So for example, if you're not eligible for anything else in terms of government assistance or just keeping body and soul together, you're eligible for the last resort welfare program called General Relief. General Relief provides $221 a month for all of your needs, which is exactly the same dollar amount that it provided in 1983 when I first sued the county because it wasn't enough money in 1983. I had a lot of other lawyers. So there are 108,000 people by last count trying to survive in LA County on $221 a month. And there is no one talking about building any housing that's affordable to someone whose total income is $221 a month. So there is this income disparity that's become more and more obvious, but it's also in terms of what happens to households. Both a consequence, particularly of structural racism in the housing markets over a period of time, and other things, that there are huge disparities in wealth as well. So it's one thing if you're paying 90% of your income for rent, it's another if you have nothing in the bank. So that even a small expense can make you miss a rent payment. And unless you have one of those nice landlords, and there are some, but a lot are not, they're not going to cut you any slack because there's someone else who will pay the rent. You're out of there. And the disparities in wealth are remarkably great in Los Angeles. The Federal Reserve Philadelphia branch, I think, for some reason, did a study of wealth disparities in Los Angeles County. And in LA County, white households have a median net worth of $355,000. Much of that is in the housing that they were able to acquire and family wealth acquired because they were not redlined over the years. So I'm glad to hear that the series is continuing on that issue. But compared to $355,000, the average Black household in LA County has a net worth of $3,500, 1% of the net worth of white households. And for what the Federal Reserve called Mexicans, the household net worth was $4,000 total. So we certainly have a huge shortage of housing, but we have a huge surplus of extremely poor people. And COVID only amplified all of that. The census began during COVID doing what's called the pulse survey. So every 2 weeks, they do a rapid turnaround survey. And this morning I was looking at the pulse survey that came out today, which has data through March 15th. And it's at the state level because they don't have a big enough sample size for smaller levels. But for rental households in California, white households, 5% are behind in the rent. The numbers for other racial groups are Latinx, 19%, Black, 17.5%, Asian, 15%, and 2 or more races, 25%. So there are really 2 kinds of housing and homelessness crises going on. One for white people and one for everybody else, basically. So there is no response to any of this problem that can really be effective unless it addresses those issues of racial disparity, meaning that just as we've had to take affirmative extra steps to get vaccines into some neighborhoods, we're going to have to take affirmative extra steps to get some of this new rental assistance aid into neighborhoods. Because if we leave it to the usual way in which things are distributed and the usual way that bureaucracies operate, we're going to have that expected tsunami. It will not probably be a tsunami, but a series of waves spaced out a little bit over time because of which cases will get filed when, but we will still see a very large number of evictions. And those evictions can begin on July 1st. So we don't know at this point how effective some of the interventions will be that Faiza talked about, and we could go into in some greater detail later, but that's basically sort of trying to situate the problem where we are, which is a catastrophe on top of a disaster.
Thank you. Yeah, so I was going to ask Gary, but I think you answered at the end there. You know, is this a tsunami? I think you described it as a series of waves instead that will take place over a generation if something isn't done.
Well, just one follow-up point on that, and that is we predicted 365,000 households at severe risk. The number of households in LA County that are now behind on the rent as of this month is 300,000 households. So that the elements of that tsunami are still there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing on top of
Please go ahead.
You said, if that's okay. I think it's important that we're going to understand that we're going to be feeling the effects of this for years to come. So the waves are long lasting, I think, because especially when it comes to the rent debt, if it's not cleared, and given the severe rent burden and the number of people that are severely rent burdened, they're then going to be carrying the severe rent burden and thousands of dollars of debt. And their job prospects are still not 100%. It's not back. The economy is not back, especially for low wage workers. So when can we expect them to be able to participate in the recovery if they are carrying all of this. And so, yeah, I just think it's important for policymakers to understand that this isn't something, this is a multi-year problem, generational actually, because then you think about children that live in these households as well. And so it's very alarming.
Yeah,
I
and,
can
and just
also,
to, oh, please go ahead, Pam.
I just wanted to add, to what Faiza said. It's something that we'll feel for years to come. I do want to say that I think we are also feeling it now in terms of the community-based organizations and autonomous groups on the ground that are responding to everything that Gary just shared with us. I know that through Stay Housed LA County, Eastside Leads is a part of that. We are a contracted community-based partner that takes the calls of tenants from throughout LA County who are facing severe harassment, who are facing illegal eviction, who are living in illegal units. And I know of tenants that fall under the category, Gary, that you mentioned of general relief, that live on $220 a month. And here's this particular tenant's reality. She lives in Los Angeles. She rents an illegal unit. Her utilities were shut off. What is, you call 211, which we did. You don't qualify for affordable housing, ma'am. Your income doesn't meet even the most basic, to qualify, because you won't sustain the rent. So as families are falling into houselessness, that is a barrier that I think we are already facing today. How do we keep communities, how do we keep families that are already being evicted? Because again, there's no true moratorium, but they're being evicted because they may have been confused about the local laws, because for many reasons, right, that we are hearing on Stay House. But then the response is, we don't have housing for you. We don't have housing at your income. Tenants then have to go find housing, right? So you all of a sudden have a family that's been displaced. They're asking countywide, they have to leave their communities. And the response from the property owner is, well, can you sustain the rent? Because obviously you were evicted because you couldn't pay the rent. So I do think that it's an effect, what Gary and Faiza mentioned, we're already facing it now. And I think it's imperative, it's important, it's urgent that our elected officials see that, feel that, because I do see that they're still working under the belief of what was before the pandemic, right? About commodifying, that it is a commodity to rent, that, the market is not the same. So I do think it's on all of us. It's on to also put that pressure, raise those voices, because the need is now. And houselessness will only continue to increase because the system doesn't have the solutions. The system is the 211, the system is the housing services. They're not able to meet. And what is it going to look like? I do want to pose this question as well. When families that may have been displaced this year during the pandemic go and apply for an affordable housing complex that may already have a 5,000 person waiting list, which is the reality. It was the reality before the pandemic. It's the reality today. But they lost income during the pandemic. So there are challenges, but I do want to end it in a happy note. There's also coalitions thinking about solutions with people like Faiza, Brady, and Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Pam. And I want to talk about the organizing that's being done on the ground to try to address the situation. And before asking that, for those that are listening to this, perhaps at a later date, just to contextualize it, this is happening end of March 2021. We're hearing that LA County might move into the quote orange tier next week, which means things are going to be opening even further. So there's signs of hope in terms of the public health crisis, but what we're talking about here is something that's looming on the horizon. And so I want to ask Pam if you can talk a little bit more about the movement to cancel rent. When tenants are demanding cancel rent, what do they mean, and what is this movement? Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on? I know that Eastside Leads is very involved in this movement.
Cancel rent and cancel mortgages, because it goes hand in hand in the work that Eastside Leads has been supporting, is really about keeping families, keeping the most vulnerable residents that, again, Faisa and Gary shared really strong demographics and data on, housed and healthy during the pandemic. We may be moving into an orange tier, but there are still, I mean, we're not even at 10% of vaccination, or maybe we are, but nationwide, what does that really mean? And for the county of 10 million people, it's still a risk, right? Canceling rent and mortgages is, again, keeping everybody housed. It is through the lens of public health. It is through the lens of keeping communities here now. Who makes a community? Who gives culture to a community? What is a place without the people? And that's why canceling rents is so important to tenants, is so important to the base that Eastside Leads organizes alongside with, because they are close to 70% of renters in East LA. I mean, we don't organize with all 70%, but you know what I mean? There's 70% of people that rent in East LA. They are the essential workers. They are the ones who have lost multiple family members during this pandemic and who haven't been able to grieve for that loss because they're in survivor mode. And again, like the folks calling, the people, the most impacted tenants calling for canceling rents, they were already struggling to survive before. They're struggling to survive and grieve now, but they know that this is possible. They know I am inspired by the fact that when they say canceling rents, they quickly also say, and we know that there are small property owners that are struggling too. It is, I've never really heard a tenant say, we live in this silo, we live alone in our bubble of tenants. No, they see it themselves as a community. I'm a tenant myself, but I'm not a tenant impacted the same way that the members that I organize with are. And so when we say cancel rent, it started, at least for Eastside Leads, hearing from our members that the concern, right? We cannot make the rent. We can't go to work. The laws are confusing. This was in March, this was in May, this was April of last year, right? We had a patchwork of protections, although we did have that Rule 1 that Faisa mentioned, but still confusing. So, we heard about a bigger group of coalition partners. They were talking about canceling rent as well, and that's the Healthy LA Coalition. Healthy LA today brings together over 300 organizations, community-based. Some are nonprofit, some are volunteer orgs, some are fully volunteer run. And that believe, right, that again, this is a public health issue. We have to keep our communities in place. And we started developing a framework, and what that framework was, and which Faisa was, y'all can go into our Healthy LA website and see what that town hall was when we publicized it to a broad community beyond just Healthy LA members. What we were saying then is you have to cancel the rents and you have to cancel the mortgages for everyone that's been impacted by COVID-19, whose income has suffered. At the time, we still don't differentiate. For us, it means everyone impacted by the pandemic. We said, that would be in effect until we are safely recovered, until we are at the safest point of the county reopening, until the metrics that we laid for ourselves in this policy was until the vaccine is fully available and free. Today, we have youth that can't get vaccinated. Let's remember that. We still have our young people under the age of 18, I believe, that don't have that access to the vaccine yet. But that was the guidelines that we set for canceling rent up until that. Canceling rent was also not about forward-looking rent. It's about the past debt. The debt that leads to harassment, the debt that leads to the stress of a tenant, a mother that cannot make ends meet. You know, again, 22% of women-headed households were already rent burdened before the pandemic. That's only become worse during the pandemic. And then our tenants, our leaders, right? These community-based organizations for Eastside Leads, we take that policy back to our members. We talk about it, right? They have to give it their blessing too. They guide that process. And they said, well, for small landlords, how do we define a small landlord? Who would benefit from canceling mortgages? So we identified that those would be property owners with 4 units or less, you know, those true mom and pop landlords in the county. We also added, you know, there are landlords who have not harassed their tenants, who have a good history of maintaining the units habitable. That was a metric that we in the policy said, in order for a property owner to benefit from canceling mortgages, you have to be in good standing, no harassment or no habitability complaints against you. And so we believe this is possible, right? In December, we were working towards the federal funds that were coming. We just had a new round of federal funds. We don't know exactly the number. Faiza and Gary may know more, but it is possible. You know, for our tenants, it means back in 2008, you know, we bailed out the banks. Right now, we're asking for humanity. We want to remain in our homes, in the communities where we have known for a long time. So that's what canceling rent and mortgages is protecting our communities so that when we recover, we're all still here and we're recovering on a stronger plane. Brady?
Thank you. Thank you. And I just put the Healthy LA website in the chat for those that are interested. Before I bring it back to Faiza and Gary, I also wanted to encourage anyone in the audience to please begin typing in questions into the chat. We can field them and work them into the conversation as well. So please go ahead and do that. And so we have folks on the ground, Healthy LA, tenants demanding cancel rent. Now, I want to kind of dive into the government response here a little bit. And, you know, I teach a class called Intro to Public Administration, and there's a section on that that's all about intergovernmental relations. And I'm going to go on a limb and say that it's one of the more boring sections from the student's perspective. Not because of me, but just because it's hard to find interesting, compelling case studies of how state, federal, and local governments interact that feels like it touches people's lives. And I think this is perhaps a great example of this. So I'm going to start using this in my classes perhaps, but I wanted to dive into that. And so I'll ask Faiza first, can local governments just cancel rent? And how is it that what City of Los Angeles can or will do, how is that shaped by what the state of California or the federal government does in response?
Yeah, sure. So I'm happy to answer that question. I think just to add on top of what Pam is saying, so people can understand why government needs to act here, is that, like, again, you have hundreds of thousands of people in Los Angeles that currently, due to the shutdowns that we needed to protect public health, could not work, lost income, could not pay their rent. So all of this is through no fault of their own. And so the expectation should not be for these people to then have to carry the burden of billions of dollars of unpaid rent debt. And so government needs to act because this was the result of government action. And I think we need to take action because of our economic recovery, because for public health reasons, to prevent displacement. There are so many reasons why government needs to act on the rent debt. And I think in terms of their powers, so cities and counties, the state government, federal government, they have cities and counties can act using their so-called police powers. And what that means is just they can take any actions to protect the public health, general welfare. And during the pandemic, they have had expanded emergency powers. So for example, the mayor cited these emergency powers in ordering the eviction protections. And then the county used these emergency powers to expand its eviction protections countywide to cover all cities. And so they're just sort of the basis for them to act further, to take action. And they can use these powers so long as there's a rational basis or justification to cancel the rent. They can also do it to commandeer hotels to house the unhoused. And there are constitutional limits, but I think based on our analysis of what the Constitution requires, a policy can be crafted to meet the constitutional tests. And I think that's why, anyway, we developed our platform to kind of provide universal relief for tenants. That would be just clearing their rent obligations, but also using the limited financial resources to set up a landlord hardship fund. So landlords that are vulnerable, losing their properties, the small mom and pops that Pam talked about, could access that money because of their lost rent. And then prevent anything, another goal was to prevent the corporate consolidation of housing, because that is a real risk and something that happened after the 2008 crisis, which was private equity firms gobbling up large swaths of real estate. And so now our commodified housing is being held by these corporations. And so the small rent that people are struggling to pay is just enriching people at the top. And so you have a wealth transfer happening from people at the bottom to people at the top. And so the cancel rent demand is really about stopping that wealth transfer, and saying that tenants need to be helped first and universally. And landlords aren't constitutionally guaranteed a profit there during this pandemic. And so I think government can act. They must act to clear the debt. And so I'll just spend a little bit of time, if I have it, to just talk about rental assistance, because the government's response has not been to cancel rent. The government's response has been to set up rental assistance. And so the federal government has, in December, they passed $25 billion of rental assistance, and they just recently passed another round, $21.6 billion of rental assistance. The state of California got $2.6 billion in the first round. And it's kind of split. It's very confusing how it's set up, but essentially the state of California now has, under SB 91, created a framework for the rental assistance coming to the state. And it sort of forgives rent if the tenant can qualify. And this is where I was talking about the setting up systems that are hard for tenants to access will let tenants slip through the cracks. So the state program says that if tenants can demonstrate their eligibility, there are a number of things they have to show to demonstrate their eligibility. They have to show they are risk of homelessness or housing instability. They have to show that they lost income or were impacted by the pandemic, and they have to show that they are 80% AMI and below. And then if they can show that, they can apply for rental assistance. And under the state program, if landlords choose to take part of the program, they can get 80% of the rent debt from April 2020 to March 31st, 2021. And they have to agree to forgive 20%. This is an opt-in program. So landlords have to choose to participate. And we've already heard from some landlords that they do not want to do that. They will not accept less than 100% of their rent debt. So if a landlord chooses not to participate in this program, tenants can get 25% of their rent debt, only 25%. And the rest of it, they're still going to be on the hook for. And also, in addition, it only covers, again, through March 2021. April rent, which is due in a few days, April, May, and June rent, they can only get 25% regardless. They get 25% of the contract rent. So what this means is, in June, when the state program expires, hopefully, if enough landlords opt in, we will have cleared a large amount of the rent debt, hopefully. But we're still going to have tenants who have not recovered yet with April, May, June rent. We're also going to have tenants who whose landlords refused, and so only got 25% covered and still have rent debt. All of these tenants can be facing eviction. They can be facing small claims judgments. I didn't even mention that whole scheme that the state says that landlords starting August 1st can go to small claims or civil court to seek the rent debt. So this first round of money is all just going to cover partial amounts. Now, the second round of federal dollars that are coming, the $21.6 billion, it's going to be allocated similarly to states and cities, but we're not sure if it's going to flow through the SB 91 sort of framework. I certainly hope not, because like I said, it does not cover April, May, June rent, and it's also contingent on landlord acceptance. So I think from a coalition standpoint, we are going to be demanding that the government still take action to cancel any remaining rent debt, because at the end of the day, we can't have tenants emerging from this pandemic with rent debt.
Yeah, thank you. So, Gary, I know you're also a professor. I wanted to ask if you could give our local governments a grade so far on their response to the pandemic. What grade would you give them? And maybe beyond that, what would it take for them to get that A grade? How do we effectively house the crisis? I know you've also published a report on the same name with your colleagues.
Well, I give them an E for effort.
Okay.
I don't attribute any bad intentions or lack of positive intention. It's just that a lot of what has been done has been at a level that's fundamentally symbolic and not really appropriate to the level of the problem that we have. And because it's not the kind of disaster that the big earthquake will be or something like that, it's been pretty easy for them to say, well, we're going to spend $1 billion here, $1 billion there. But if you do the math, the 2.6 billion works out to an average of about $2,500 for tenants who are behind on the rent. And that's not even the average rent for the average households for 1 month. So it's obviously not going to stretch as far as it needs to be. I do think that Los Angeles, the city of LA, has done a good thing in deciding to actually give preference to the poorest people. That is, the people who start at 30% of the average or the area median income, and then 50%, and then only go up to 80%, because I think that'll overcome some of the disparities that just happen in the way bureaucracies work and people's differential access to computerized systems and all that sort of thing. But to actually house the crisis, meaning house the people who are going to be displaced if we don't stop the displacement. I do think that we have to have a contingency plan that's better than what we have now, which is nothing on the scale that we're talking about. So one of the we've looked into as part of our efforts at the Luskin Center at UCLA looked into two particularly promising in this grand scale of things approaches to short-term interventions. Some of them have long-term prospects. One of those is the conversion of what have been tourist hotels and motels to housing. We had a project Room Key, which basically spent a lot of money and housed some people temporarily, but then we have nothing left to show for the money. So we have begun at a small scale acquiring those properties, which are not really appropriate without a lot of work for families, but they're appropriate for singles and couples, and maybe 3 people with one small, including one small child. And so that's something that we should be doing, and we should be trying to get site control of every such place there is, because the land is the hardest thing to come by in LA, even if the building is ultimately not suitable. And then as a very last resort, we have looked at the issue of things that are in the category of refugee camps, or what would be better than a refugee camp, which is what you end up with. Well, what you end up with is what we have now, which is refugee camps created by refugees themselves, economic refugees, as is the case primarily for the people in Echo Park who are, today wondering what's going to happen to them tomorrow, the people who haven't been moved out. And that's just, one of thousands of such encampments. So one of the things that we looked into was the use of small manufactured structures that cost $8,000 as opposed to $500,000 for a unit. In particular, were manufactured by people who were formerly homeless. So there's an employment aspect to it. And if it's done right, as it has been in Seattle and in Portland, in some instances, it's a result that people prefer to their other options, including being in mass shelters. The worst place we can end up is in big congregate shelters, big rooms full of cots, which are not really good for anybody, and they're certainly not going to work for families. So we should have some contingency planning. We have all this emergency planning for this massive earthquake on the San Andreas Fault. Well, that may come in the next 30 years. We're talking about July 1st. So it's we should be speeding up our preparation for that. And God willing, that won't come to pass, but we should be ready. And then when we're done with that, we need not only to return to the 40 years of failure to produce housing that's affordable to truly low-income people, and an economic development approach that doesn't do Silicon Valleys, but does things that will employ people who don't have advanced degrees and people who have been produced by the education system that we have. So I think this is could be a watershed moment for the state. I don't have a lot of hope that our politicians will see it as an opportunity to basically transform the whole state into a more inclusive and equitable place. But there's nothing written in stone that says that couldn't happen.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned Echo Park. We had a couple students in the chat asking the question, what's going to happen to folks in tent encampments that are being swept up by LASA, by city government. So I wanted to bring it to Pam now, and hopefully, as we're wrapping things up, hopefully ending on a slightly lighter note, or more positive note, I should say.
Yeah.
What would a Los Angeles look like where renters are protected and empowered? And I, of course, am asking because I want to hear your sort of utopian vision, but I also want to bring it closer to, well, what can we do that we're not currently doing, and what, for those students that are here, those that are in the audience, what can they do to get involved as well?
For sure. So I think, what can we do? It's more like, what must we do? And like I mentioned, the cancel rent and mortgages policy was crafted in coalition, but also with the guidance of the most impacted tenants. That's important. We have to really, the history has shown us that policies and solutions that our government sometimes doesn't necessarily come because they centered the needs of the most impacted at the time, right? It's usually very difficult to access because of language. It's very difficult to access because of the time that these meetings, that these decision makers are needing. So I think that in that utopia, it's really what community and grassroots organizations and legal service providers that work alongside organizers and community, is you have to center the needs of residents when you do policy, when you do craft those solutions, because those solutions, they know it. Who knows it best? Those that are living it. So canceling rents and mortgages shouldn't be a policy that gets brushed to the side, because it's a solution that's coming from the ground up. With Echo Park Rising, that's a place where we can find hope, right? That is all volunteer led and run solutions. Public land for public good is essentially what those tenants are saying. Their tenants, they're our neighbors in Echo Park, saying this is a public land. We must use public land, public money, public funding for the needs of the people. And the people are the most impacted. They are the ones living in the streets. So if you want to get involved, Street Watch LA today their hardest fight is today, tonight. If you feel healthy, if you are safe, coming tonight to Echo Park and being part of the rotation of workers is important. Since the start of the pandemic, organizers and volunteers and legal service providers through the National Lawyers Guild have responded where sometimes our systems have failed us. How? When an illegal eviction comes through, it is the community that comes through. It is your neighbors, it is your family, it is that community, right? This is why we don't want displacement, because the people that respond is your community. So that's another piece that I want to leave everyone. It's like, this is why we see a rise in autonomous tenant unions. This is why we see a rise in GoFundMe ways, right? This is why we're seeing a rise of local community refrigerators with food. This is all volunteer run, and we are seeing strong solutions there. So Echo Park Rising is a place where you can find a lot of inspiration. Just wanted to answer that question from the student directly. Follow them on Twitter, Street Watch. If you want to be part of the rotation, you can attend, go to their tent, and they'll put you. And also I'll put my information in the chat, and I can connect you to organizers on the ground that are leading that work. In terms of policies, something that Eastside Leads has been looking into with the support of our members is this idea of social housing, right? Social housing, what is it? Decommodification of housing, the belief that housing is a human right, the belief that housing can be democratically controlled, the belief that we move by having social housing more of a social equity right? Not because of economics, not because of class, but you are equal. And there are movements in LA County and beyond that are pushing for those kinds of policies. LA County, after a lot of push from organizers on the ground, we now have a TOPA, tenant opportunity to purchase, that essentially is saying give the rights to the tenants to buy and do offers to their landlords who are struggling so that they can own and control that housing. We have a growth of a community land trust movement. Follow the community land trust efforts that are happening in LA County, supported by LAFLA as well. These are solutions that, again, if we center policy and we involve the impacted communities, you come up with these solutions. A community land trust in Boyle Heights and East LA was a dream 6 years ago. It is now an organized movement, right? So we have those solutions. And I just, again, invite everybody, get involved in your local tenants union, follow the beautiful people that are here, like Faiza and Gary, if you want to be nerdy with the policy, because we can and must build a stronger recovery. To you, Brady.
Thank you, Pam. That's a very very appropriate way to end, I think. So thank you all, Gary, Faiza, Pamela. Thank you for being here. I want to download and save the chat because there's a lot of mutual aid and resource sharing going on there. So I'm gonna see if I can download that and share that with everyone that has attended. And I will put my email address in there as well. I think others are doing the same. So for those of you that are tuning in and have questions about what resources there are in your where you're living, I know not everyone here lives in Los Angeles County, and we've been talking mainly about LA County, but there are other resources out there. So please follow up with us. And that's it. Thank you for being here.
Please bring your virtual hands together in thanking all of our wonderful panelists and Dr. Collins today. This has been super powerful and informative, and I'm really grateful that you all were able to come share your insights with us. Thank you so much.
And keep an eye out for the podcast episode, hopefully coming out in the next several months.